returning to the growth of the American Republic. By Samuel Eliot Morison and Henry Steele Commager. Volume 1. (1942). Chapter 3. The First Foundations, 1600 to 1660. 1. Virginia. All but one of the 13th English colonies, which federated as the United States of America, were founded as the result of two great waves of colonizing activity in the 17th century. The first, which began in 1606 and lasted until 1637, planted three groups of colonies: the two fruitful sisters, Virginia and Maryland, on the Chesapeake, with their off-lying sister, Bermuda; the Puritan commonwealths of New England and the British West Indies. The same period saw the establishment of the French in l'Acadie, Nova Scotia, more firmly at Quebec, and side by side with the English in the West Indies. The death of Elizabeth and the accession of James Stuart in 1603 brought about the liquidation of the secular struggles with Spain and Scotland, and released capital and Englishman power for more fruitful purposes. The lesson that private purses are cold comforts to adventurers had been well learned. Excellent results had already been obtained in foreign trade by joint stock corporations, which combined the capital of many under the management of a few chosen by stockholders. The Muscovy Company and the Levant Company, first of these overseas trading corporations, had done very well, trading with Russia and the Near East. Spectacular profits were in store for the East India Company. Each company received a monopoly of English trade with specified portions of the world, and full control over whatever trading post or colonies it might see fit to establish. They may be compared with the Great Western Railroad corporations of the United States before the Interstate Commerce Act. Like these, they used capital and labor primarily for profit, and incidentally for the good of the nation and the development of new resources. In such wise, the English colonization of Virginia was effected. Two groups of capitalists were formed, the one centering in Bristol and the other in London. The price of a share was £12, 10s. I'm not really sure. And every stockholder could take part in the quarterly meetings, called general courts, and had a vote in choosing the board of directors, known as the treasurer and council. Footnote: in the reorganizations of 1609 and 1612, in the original charter, the council was appointed by the king. Between these two Virginia companies, the English claim to North America was divided. Northern Virginia, renamed New England in 1620, fell to the Bristol Group. Southern Virginia, which also included the future Maryland and Carolina, to the landowners. The Northern Company's one attempt to plant came to grief because of an extreme, unreasonable, and frosty Maine winter. The Old Dominion of Virginia was established by the London Company. That corporation was no mere money-making scheme, although the expectation of profit certainly existed. Rather was it a national enterprise with hundreds of stockholders, great and small. The leading spirits were Sir Thomas Smith, a veteran merchant adventurer; Sir Edwin Sandys, a parliamentary leader; Nicholas Ferrar, and the Earls of Southampton, Pembroke, and Montgomery, to whom Shakespeare's first folio was dedicated. 3 ships under Captain Christopher Newport, Sarah Constant, Goodspeed, and Discovery, dropped down the Thames at Christmas tide, 1606, cheered by Michael Drayton's Ode to the Virginia Voyage. Britons, you stay too long, quickly aboard bestow you, and with a merry gale swell your stretched sail, with vows as strong as the winds that blow you. And cheerfully at sea, success you still entice, to get the pearl and gold, and ours to hold, Virginia, earth's only paradise. Virginia's Trials, as an early tract on the colony was entitled, began at once. The voyage by the Columbus route was long and tedious, and fatal to 16 of the 120 men aboard. No women were taken. Almost everything was done wrong. The Virginia Company, having inherited the ample ambitions of the Hakluyt and Gilbert era, expected to convert Indians, locate gold mines, discover the Northwest Passage, produce all the commodities of Europe, Africa, and Asia, and supply the wants of all our decayed trades. But no gold was found. Neither the James nor the Chickahominy rivers led to the Pacific, and the only commodities sent home for several years were of the forests, such as oak, clapboard, cedar, and walnut paneling. The company proposed to establish a new home for the unemployed, who swarmed into English towns when ousted from the land, but these sturdy beggars did not care to emigrate as landless wage slaves to a company. So the first colony consisted largely of decayed gentlemen, released prisoners, with a few honest artisans who found nothing to do. The company provided them with an absurd sort of local government, and although Captain Newport was instructed to choose a healthy location, he selected for Jamestown a site so malarial that it was eventually abandoned. As in Columbus's first colony over a century earlier, the men were racked by disease, poisoned or starved by the strange food, drenched through flimsy housing, for the tight, warm log cabin of the American frontier was a later Swedish contribution, and pestered by the Indians. By the spring of 1608, only 53 Englishmen were left alive, and they were saved only through the bustling activity of Captain John Smith in placating Indians and planting corn. The Virginia Company would not hear of failure. Relief was sent in 1608, and again in 1609. A fleet of 9 ships under Sir Thomas Gates. The flagship was wrecked on the Bermudas, providing material for Shakespeare's Tempest, and procuring for England the lovely islands that are now her oldest colony. Footnote: Newfoundland puts in the same claim, but although Newfoundland was formally taken possession of in 1583, the permanent English settlement there dates only from the 18th century, whilst that of Bermuda has been continuous since 1612. End of footnote. When the survivors reached Jamestown in a vessel they constructed of Bermudian cedar, the colony was reduced to the last stage of wretchedness. Every man almost laments himself of being here, wrote the governor in 1611. He despaired of making a success with such disordered persons, so profane, so riotous, besides of such diseased and crazed bodies. He hoped the king would send to Virginia, out of the common jails, all men condemned to die. They at least might be glad to make this their new country. One is not astonished at the murmurs and treasonable intendments of these workers when one reads of the regime. Twice a day they were marched into the fields by beat of drum or into the forest to cut wood, and twice a day marched back to Jamestown to eat and pray. Obviously, that sort of life would not attract Englishmen, nor could it last. The only thing that kept the colony alive was the deep faith and gallant spirit of men like Gates, Dale, Delaware, and those nameless heroes who refused to admit defeat. These men believed that they had hold of something which must not be allowed to perish. "Be not dismayed at all," says the author of A News from Virginia, 1610. "God will not let us fall." Let England know our willingness, for that our work is good. We hope to plant a nation where none before hath stood. Virginia needed more than faith and a gallant spirit to ensure permanence. She needed a profitable product, a system of land holdings that gave immigrants a stake in the country, discipline to be sure, but also liberty. In 10 years' time she obtained all these. Between 1615 and 1625, Virginia was transformed from an unsuccessful trading post ruled by iron discipline and hated by most of her people into a commonwealth that began to open a new and wonderful life to the common man of England. Tobacco culture, which never entered into the founders' plans, saved Virginia. Smoking was probably brought to England by Sir John Hawkins in the 1560s. Tobacco is the Arawak Indian word for the cigars which they inhaled through the nostrils. But North American Indians used long-stemmed pipes with stone bowls from the Great Red Pipe Stone Quarry, if they could get them. The variety of tobacco that the Indians cultivated around Roanoke was praised in the official narrative of the Raleigh colony, but English smokers reported that it bit the tongue viciously, and so continued to import West Indian leaf through Spain. John Rolfe, husband to Pocahontas, is said to have been responsible for procuring seed from the West Indies around 1613, and the leaves grown from this seed on Virginian soil smoked well. Some 2,500 pounds were exported to England in 1616, 20,000 in 1617, 50,000 in 1618. Here at last was something to attract capital and labor, and make large numbers of Englishmen wish to emigrate. Unfortunately, there was a strong anti-tobacco movement in England, led by King James, who described smoking as a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs, and in the black stinking fume thereof, nearest resembling the horrible Stygian smoke of the pit that is bottomless. Tobacco planting was almost too successful for the good of the colony, which was still importing foodstuffs from England a decade after her foundation. Yet nothing could stop the colonists from planting or Englishmen from buying and smoking Virginia tobacco. Another factor was private property in land. As the indentures of the Virginia Company hired servants expired, they became tenant farmers on a sharecropping basis. By 1619, the tenants' farms extended to 20 miles along the James, and the population passed 1,000 souls. Groups of settlers, organized by some man of substance, were granted large tracts, called hundreds, which formed autonomous communities within the colony. The Pilgrim Fathers would have had a Virginia hundred if the Mayflower had sailed on time. And in 1618, the company devised head rights, which became the basis of land tenure in all the southern English colonies. By this system, persons who emigrated at their own expense were granted 50 acres free for each member of their party, or for any subsequent immigrant whose passage money they paid. Thus private gain and individual enterprise were enlisted to build up the colony, and labor supply kept pace with that of arable land. English law and liberty came as well. In 1618, the company issued instructions to the new governor, Sir George Yeardley, ordering him to introduce English common law and the orderly process thereof, and summon a representative assembly with power to make bylaws subject to the company's consent in England. Democracy made her American debut on the 30th of July, 1619, when 22 burgesses, 2 from each settled district, elected by the vote of all men aged 17 and upward, met with the governor's council in the church at Jamestown. The session lasted but 6 days. The few laws passed had to be validated by the company in England, and another assembly was not chosen until 1621. But the Virginia Assembly of 1619 was the earliest representative body in the New World. From that time forth, government of the people, however limited or thwarted, has been a fundamental principle of the English colonies, and the United States. No colony of any other nation obtained representative institutions before the 19th century, as long as it lasted, the parent company in England exerted far more power in Virginia than this popular assembly. But the company itself was democratic in spirit, a movement of the small 12-pound 10s stockholders in 1619 unseated Sir Thomas Smith, the experienced London merchant who had been treasurer and executive head during the most difficult years, and elected Sir Edwin Sandys, a leader of the opposition in the House of Commons, tolerant in religion and liberal in outlook. Convinced that the colony's exclusive preoccupation with tobacco was unsound and politically dangerous, Sandys induced the stockholders to adopt a 5-year plan for Virginia. French vines, vintners, and olive trees. French vines, vintners, and olive trees, lumbermen from the Baltic, iron workers from England were procured or hired to start new industries, and thousands of poor Englishmen and women were assisted to emigrate. Unfortunately, all this required more expense than the company was able to bear, and the colony was ill prepared to receive an influx of 4,000 people in 4 years. Ships were overcrowded, housing facilities inadequate, and the loss of life from typhus, malaria, malnutrition, and overwork continued to be appalling. Moreover, most of the artisans and specialized farmers whose passage had been paid dropped what they were supposed to do in order to cultivate the great cash crop. Plantations were laid out too far apart. Defense was neglected, and in 1622 a surprise attack by the Indians destroyed the infant iron works at the falls of the James River, erased almost every settlement outside Jamestown, and in a night wiped out the gains of 3 years. This gave the enemies of Sandys a handle against him, convinced the king that the colony had been grossly mismanaged, resulted in legal proceedings against the charter and the dissolution of the Virginia Company of London. Virginia now became a royal province or crown colony, but she did not lose the large measure of self-government that she had won. The Assembly, the courts of justice, and other organs of local government already being evolved were retained. Governor and council, however, were now appointed by the King of England and subject to royal instructions. This change was not unpopular in the colony. Virginia never has liked economic planning. Charles I, not unaffected by the large revenue he was obtaining from the customs on Virginia tobacco, interfered with the colony less than the company had, and development continued along tobacco plantation lines. When we think of 17th century Virginia, we should first banish from our minds the cavalier myth of gallants and fair ladies living a life of silken ease that was created by poets and romantic novelists of the 19th century. We must picture a series of farms and plantations lining the James, the York, and the Rappahannock rivers up to the fall line and beginning to extend along the south bank of the Potomac. There are few houses more than 5 miles from tidewater. The average farm, not above 300 or 400 acres, will be cultivated by the owner and his family, and a few white indentured servants of both sexes. The house is a story and a half. Frame cottage, kept warm in winter by great log fires. Around it is a vegetable garden and orchard. Beyond, corn and tobacco fields, enclosed by zigzag Virginia fences of split rails, and beyond that, woodland, where the cattle and hogs fend for themselves. In course of a few years, when the original tobacco fields are exhausted, the woodland will be cleared and put under tillage, while the old fields, after a few diminishing crops of corn, will revert to brush and woodland. Few horses, and still fewer wheeled vehicles, will be seen outside Jamestown until after 1650, when New England becomes few horses and still fewer wheeled vehicles will be seen outside Jamestown until after 1650, when New England begins to export horses. But almost every farmer keeps a yoke of ox for plowing, and a boat on creek or river. If the owner prospers, he will procure more land from someone who has more head rights than he cares to take up. The few plantations established by men who came out with considerable capital have large houses and more outbuildings, keep a store for selling English goods to their neighbors, and a wharf and a warehouse for handling their tobacco. Ever so often, the big planter orders the London merchant who handles his tobacco crop to send him out another parcel of indented servants, for each of whom he will obtain 50 acres more land. If no ungranted land is available near the homestead, he will seat a second plantation elsewhere, and put his son or a trusty servant, whose time is up, in charge. Most early settlers of Virginia came from the middle class and the better sort of English farmers. They were seeking both freedom and opportunity. Many of the founders of great families, such as John Washington, ancestor of the General and Captain Thomas Stagg, whose nephew, the first William Byrd, inherited his estate, were shipmasters who came to Virginia to trade, but became so entranced by earth's only paradise that they planted. A handful of families in Virginia had noble or genteel connections, but with these exceptions, the first families of Virginia became first families in Virginia. Nor can it be denied that they worked hard to win and maintain their position. The diary of William Byrd II at the turn of the century is that of an active farmer, trader, and public servant. He enjoyed far less leisure than did the landed gentry in England, and employed much of the leisure that he had in reading the ancient classics and modern theology. During the first half of the century, the manners and customs of Virginia were definitely Puritan. The code of laws passed by the first Virginia Assembly against idleness, gambling, drunkenness, and excess in apparel might as well have been passed by a New England colony. The Virginia laws against Sabbath breaking and contempt of the Bible or the ministry were almost as severe as in Massachusetts. Days of fasting and humiliation were held in the one colony as in the other to placate Jehovah after a pestilence or an Indian victory. Witchcraft was prosecuted in both, although no witches were hanged except in New England, and none burned to death anywhere in the English colonies. The typical library of a Virginia gentleman contained about the same proportion of religious literature as that of his fellow in New England, and usually the same books, for the neo-paganism of Elizabeth's reign had now worn off, and Englishmen, like other Christians, were eager to understand the mysteries of life and death, and to stand well with their God. The Church of England was early established in Virginia, and Puritan congregations were outlawed in 1643. The Book of Common Prayer had to be read. Such Puritanism as there was in the Virginia Church came from absence of Anglican discipline and authority rather than from an aggressive Puritan doctrine and a cohesive Puritan community. And as time flowed on, the great fortunes were built up from tobacco. The Puritan tinge passed from the Old Dominion. Below the independent landowners in Virginia were the English indented servants. These were the main source of labor in the Chesapeake colonies throughout this pioneer period, and an important one in New England. Indented servants were mostly lads and lasses in their late teens or early 20s, members of large families in the English towns and countryside, who were looking for a better chance than the overcrowded trades afforded by the old country. They were attracted by "Come all ye" ballads like the Maidens of London's Brave Adventurers. The reason, as I understand, why you go to that nation is to inhabit that far land and make a new plantation, where you shall have good ground enough for planting and for tilling, which never shall be taken away so long as you are willing. Then come, brave lasses, come away, conducted by Apollo. Although that you do go before your sweethearts, they will follow. Nor were they much deterred by counter-propaganda, such as the ballad of the Truppened Maiden, of which these stanzas are a sample. I have played my part both at plough and cart, in the land of Virginie, oh. Billets from the wood upon my back they load, even then I am weary, 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 oh. Instead of drinking beer, I drink the water clear, in the land of Virginie, oh. Which makes me pale and wan, do all that ere I can, when that I am weary, 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 oh. Many of these boys and girls succumbed to the change of climate, although not nearly so many as in the early years of the colony. Men and women alike performed any sort of labor their master required for a space of 5 years, which might be extended for ill conduct, and at the end of that time were dismissed with a few tools and clothes. In Maryland, each servant was given 50 acres of land by the Lord Proprietor. The more energetic freedmen would then earn money by wage labor and set up farmers themselves. Most of the girls married, while the shiftless drifted to the frontier as squatters or became rural paupers. A hard system it was, according to modern lights, yet it enabled thousands of poor Englishmen and women, and in the 18th century tens of thousands of Scots, Irish, Germans, and Swiss to make a fresh start in life and take an active part in the forming of the American nation. Possession of capital gave any early settler a great advantage in procuring land and labor by the head right system. Footnote on the stanza The Trepanned Maiden. Trepanned, spelt Trepanned, was 17th century English for kidnapped, and also included those who were persuaded to sell their services for 5 years by false promises. End of footnote. Possession of capital gave any early settler a great advantage in procuring land and labor by the head right system. For instance, Captain Adam Thorogood had built up as early as 1635 an estate of 5,350 acres in several different parcels on Chesapeake Bay. The nucleus was 2,050 acres, granted to him for bringing over his wife, son, and 41 servants in 1628. The rest were for sundry shipments in 17 different vessels during the next 6 years. All these were white servants, but we find William Bannister bringing in Abbas and Negar, and Anthony, William, Mary, John, Jacob, Negars, spelt Negars, in 1638, whilst Robert Taliaferro had 6,300 acres confirmed to him in 1666 for the transportation of 126 persons, of whom 16 were Negroes. Great planters, such as these early secured, and their descendants long maintained political and social control of the colony. They monopolized the seats in the council, all offices of honor and profit. The House of Burgesses, although elected on a democratic franchise, was largely composed of relatives or social allies of the great planters. Negro slavery helped the rich to grow richer in colonial Virginia. A Dutch ship brought slaves from Africa to Jamestown as early as 1619, but slavery did not become a characteristic feature of Virginia society until nearly the end of the century. It became so then for 3 reasons. England restricted the emigration of white bond servants. The Royal African Company became more efficient, and a catastrophic fall in the price of tobacco ruined the small farmers, permitting profits only to men who had the capital to purchase cheap and self-propagating labor. Virginia in 1700, with an estimated population of 72,000, was exporting to England about 11,500,000 pounds of tobacco. Virginia in 1700, with an estimated population of 72,000, was exporting to England about 11,500,000 pounds of tobacco, half of which was re-exported to the continent. Virginia was the most English of the English colonies, and more rural than any part of England, until Norfolk and Williamsburg were founded. At the very close of the century. There was no settlement with more than a few score persons. Even Jamestown was almost deserted when the council or assembly was not in session. It was so easy to import articles of necessity and luxury from England in exchange for tobacco that local trades did not prosper. Seeds of antagonism were early sown by the exploitation of Virginia at the hands of the English merchants, who, if the assembly pegged the price of tobacco, cynically raised the price of English goods. The Virginians were intensely loyal to their mother country and proud of being Englishmen, but they were also firmly rooted in their new homes and conscious of being Virginians. A traveler reported of Jamaica in 1763, the generality of its inhabitants look upon themselves as passengers only. That could not have been said of the people of any continental colony 20 years after its foundation. Conditioning for independence began almost immediately on the shores of Chesapeake Bay. Picking up again. 2. Maryland and the English West Indies. Maryland, a colony with the same soil, climate, economic, and social systems as Virginia, owed her separate existence and her special character to the desire of a great Englishman to create a feudal domain for his family and a refuge for members of his faith. Gilbert Raleigh and half a dozen lesser men had attempted the like and failed, but the proprietary method of colonization continued side by side with the corporate, because land was the safest investment, and many acres meant social security. Land was something you could not lose except by conquest or confiscation, and if it paid no profit in your own time, it would certainly take care of your descendants, the way population was increasing. The main difficulty was this: the expense of carrying a colony along to a point where it was self-supporting was too great for all but a few individuals. Sir George Calvert, first Lord Baltimore, was a stockholder of the Virginia Company, who aspired to found a colony of his own. He failed once in Newfoundland. When he settled in Virginia, he was ordered out because he was a Roman Catholic convert. He then asked for and obtained from Charles I a liberal slice of the Old Dominion, with which, now that the Virginia Company was no more, the king had a right to do as he chose. This original Maryland grant extended from the Potomac River north to New England, but was later cut in on by another royal handout, Pennsylvania. Lord Baltimore died while the Maryland Charter was going through in 1632, but it was confirmed to his son and heir, Cecilius. This second Lord Baltimore, and first Lord Proprietor of the province of Maryland, dispatched the first group of colonists who settled at St. Mary's and near the mouth of the Potomac in 1634. They experienced no starving time, for settled Virginia was near, and the local Indians were friendly. But the Susquehanna tribe that lived along upper Chesapeake Bay later gave the colony much trouble. Cecilius Calvert intended Maryland not only as a source of profit, but as a refuge for English Roman Catholics. One required as much faith and fortitude to be a good Catholic in the England of that era as in the Germany of Hitler. Yet for reasons yet unexplained, comparatively few English Catholics emigrated to Maryland. Almost from the start, the colony had a Protestant majority. Calvert coped with his situation in a statesmanlike manner by inducing the Maryland Assembly to pass a law of religious toleration in 1649. He had summoned an assembly since his charter required that the laws have the consent of the freedmen, but allowed it little power and conferred most of the lucrative offices on his relatives and Catholic friends. The local civil war that broke out in Maryland in 1654 was essentially a class war of Protestant small farmers against the Catholic magnates and lords of manors. The majority won, and the Act of Toleration was repealed, but Lord Baltimore eventually recovered his rights. In the West Indies, also, English and French used the proprietary method of colonization with success. The Caribbean is the American Mediterranean in a strategic as well as a climatic sense. There the Spaniards established their base for the conquest of Mexico. There in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, English, French, and Dutch seized vantage points that destroyed the American monopoly of Spain and rendered her communications insecure. There in the 1780s, the naval supremacy of the War of Independence was decided. There, in Haiti, Napoleon was forced to renounce his American empire and cede Louisiana to the United States. There, the United States was erected the outer defenses of the Panama Canal. The superb are of islands flung out eastward from Yucatan have an amazing fertility. The extension of sugar culture around 1650 made even the smallest of them immensely valuable, and the slaves imported from Africa thrived beyond all expectation. Far more money and men were spent on defending and capturing these islands in the colonial era than on the continental colonies that became the United States, because they were much more profitable to their owners. As none of the islands east of Puerto Rico were effectively occupied by the Spaniards, these lesser Antilles attracted small-time English and French adventurers who were unable to swing a continental venture like Maryland or Canada. Carib Indians broke up the earliest English and French attempts in St. Lucia and Grenada, and on the wild coast of Guyana. In 1624, permanent footholds on the island of St. Kitts were secured by Sir Thomas Warner and by Pierre Bilan des Nambucc. Warner's men spilled over into nearby Montserrat, Nevis, and Antigua. Des Nambucc, as governor of Cardinal Richelieu's Compagnie des Îles d'Amérique, began pushing out the Caribs from Martinique and Guadeloupe in 1635. Captain John Powell took possession of Barbados, which the Caribs had fortunately vacated in 1625, and English colonization of it began within 2 years. The Earl of Carlisle obtained a proprietary patent to all the Caribbee Islands, but, unlike Lord Baltimore, did nothing for them. Government and profits alike were farmed out. It did not much matter, for the great emigration was underway, and those English who wanted a warm climate and quick profits turned to the islands. Often families split between islands and continent. John Winthrop, governor of Massachusetts, had a son Samuel in Antigua and another in Barbados, who sent him tobacco that the governor described as very ill conditioned, a fowl full of stalks and evil colored. Personal footnote on the spelling. It's horrendous. This is not the English of the day. It's just horrendous spelling. Verye, ill, spelled Verye, ill, condition. Foul, spelled Fowle, evil, spelt with two L's, etc. End of footnote. The John Jefferson, who represented Flounderdew 100 in the First Virginia Assembly, later helped Sir Thomas Warner to found the English colony at St. Kitts, and also became a leading planter in Antigua. Thomas Jefferson is possibly descended from his brother. Robert Rich, Earl of Warwick, a leading promoter of settlement in New England, Virginia, and Bermuda, attempted a variety of island and maintained colonies all the way from Trinidad to the Bay Islands of Honduras, but none of these lasted long. The Caribbean also became a happy hunting ground for pirates, since its waters were traversed by the valuable supply ships and plate fleets of Spain. Owing to the Spaniards' neglect of Hispaniola, the buccaneers, a rabble of rascals from all countries, established themselves on Tortuga Island near Cape Haitian in the 1620s, hunting the wild hogs and preying on passing vessels. Tortuga, captured by the French in 1640, became the nucleus of their colony of Saint Dominique, which eventually became the wealthiest European establishment in the West Indies. The buccaneers found other places to operate from. West Indian history is notoriously complicated, and we have had to postpone consideration of the Dutch exploits to a later section of this chapter. Suffice it to say here that Dutch naval power in the Caribbean was keeping the Spaniards so busy that the French and English colonies were not much troubled, and that the Dutch provided the capital, the appliances, and the methods by which the French and English turned from less lucrative crops to sugarcane in the 1650s. Once sugar was in, white labor went out. For instance, Barbados in 1645 had a population of 36,000, of which only 5,680 were slaves. 10 years later, there were 23,000 English and 20,000 slaves. To anyone familiar with the happy-go-lucky poverty of these Lesser Antilles today, their prosperity in the 17th century is almost incredible. The French owned only half the 25-mile-long island of St. Christophe, St. Kitts. But in 1655, they could place in the field 8,000 armed men, and their governor, the Chevalier de Poissy, boasted such an establishment as Virginia did not see for another half-century. A 3.5-story chateau of brick and stone maintained by 100 French lackeys, and with formal gardens, orange groves, a model plantation, and a sugar mill to which 300 slaves were attached. 20 acres in Barbados, planted with cotton and sugar cane, yielded more profit than a great tobacco plantation in Virginia. Barbados, too, had its representative assembly, which yielded nothing to Massachusetts Bay, and Virginia in its solicitude for the liberties of Englishmen. Thus, within a generation of founding their first continental colonies at Quebec and Jamestown, France and England had tropical possessions which were small in extent, but worthy competitors to the vast Spanish Empire in sugar, dyewoods, cotton, and coffee. In the second half of the century, Spain was despoiled of Jamaica by Cromwell and of Saint Dominique by France, while smaller islands such as Saint Martin, Saint Croix, Saint Thomas, and Tobago were picked up by Dutch, Norwegians, and Danes. It seemed in 1700 as if the Spanish Empire were on the way out, but it was an unconscionable time a-dying. These non-Spanish colonies in the West Indies were closely integrated with the next group we have to consider, the English colonies in New England. With slave labor, it was more profitable for the planters to concentrate on tropical crops of high profit and procure elsewhere every other essential to living, such as salt, meat, and fish, breadstuffs and ground vegetables, lumber and livestock. These were exactly the commodities that New England produced, yet could find no vent for in England, and New England built the ships to carry these products of her farms, forests, and fisheries to the West Indies. The Chesapeake colonies, and later the Middle colonies and the Carolinas, also shared this trade, and like New England, imported the molasses and distilled it into the fiery beverage first known as rumbustion or kill devil. New England, however, would have long remained a string of poor fishing stations and hardscrabble farms, but for commerce with the superb tropical islands set in the sapphire Caribbean. End of section 2. The first foundations.